Good afternoon to everyone who's physically with us here in Palo Alto, and good day for those of you online. Good day to you wherever you are, whatever time it is. I'm Roland Green. I'm director of the Stanford Humanities Center. And I welcome you today to our final public lecture of the year. Today's event is presented as part of the Raymond F. West Memorial Series, one of the university's oldest endowed lectures. It was established in 1910 by Mr. and Mrs. Frederick West of Seattle in memory of their son. I should mention that besides those of you who are here in person in Leventhal Hall, we have more people in our online audience, including a number of former fellows whom we're always glad to see again, whether you stop by in person or you join us remotely. But as I always say, this is the last time I have to say it this year, so you won't hear me say this again until the fall. Whoever you may be, a current fellow, a former fellow, an alumnus, a student, simply an interested person, we are always glad to have you join us at these events. More and more over these past couple of years, we've come to enjoy our office as a center, as a humanities center, not just for the immediate Stanford community, but for a much more far-flung community beyond that. Before we begin, I'd like to mention to the remote audience that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow next to the CC icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. Please also note that today's event is being recorded. As some of you know, the Stanford Humanities Center is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we are one of the, first of all, we're one of the largest and oldest in the US, and we house an unusually large number of fellows who are working on their own projects with us. This year we have nearly 50 joining us for the year, and we sponsor 15 research workshops, which together hold about 150 meetings over the course of the year to foster collaboration, and we offer events like this that are open to the Stanford community and beyond. Many of our peer universities divide these functions among 2 or more centers, and we are among the few that sponsor all 3. We like to believe that these activities complement each other, that the fellows who are visiting for the year find their work enlivened by contact with speakers like today's speaker, that the research workshops benefit from the presence of the visitors and in turn help them rethink their work. And basically, we just hope that everybody comes away with insights that they've acquired at this crossroads of during the course of the year that they wouldn't have had if they had not been here for the year. In our public events, hybrid format is now our new normal. And so we're especially pleased that we're now able to connect all these different groups within our larger community here for these events and welcome everybody to join us. For the members of the virtual audience who would like to submit a question to the speaker, you may use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it following the lecture. And for those of you who are here in person, please, if you can, stay for the reception with our speaker afterwards. Oddly enough, for May 2nd in Palo Alto, it will be an indoor reception, although we have to make a call at some point in the afternoon whether outdoor will work. And obviously Eric has decided that it has to be indoor, but we'll open the door. The weather's starting to look really nice, so we can open the door and you can take your drink and your snack outside if you want. This year at the Humanities Center, we have experienced, as we often do, a number of events about the past, sometimes the remote past. I think of Gregory Levine's, the art historian Gregory Levine's talk about Zen Buddhism, which was actually sort of trans-historical about the past and the present. I think of Emily Levine's talk about the genealogy of the university. And of course, Saidiya Hartman's talk a few months ago about leftists in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s. And we often have as many or more concerned with the present. I think especially most recently of Sarah Ahmed's talk about complaint a few weeks ago. As we envisioned the year, it seemed right to conclude with a lecture on the future. And because I had been exploring her work for some time, the scholar whose work came to mind most vividly was Harriet Hawkins. Hawkins represents a mode of scholarship and teaching that should interest everyone here, and especially our PhD students, because she more or less started with a point of departure in her discipline of geography, namely the application of geographical insights to works of art. Think, for example, of landscape paintings that might be read for what they tell us about society or culture. And she developed it with a tremendous application of originality until she and others had created a new subfield, which they have come to call GeoHumanities. For Hawkins, the works of art in question need not belong to the past. They might not even exist yet, or they may come into being in conversation with geographical concepts such as space, place, or location, or just as terms that we may consider to be native to the arts. Think, for example, of imagination or creativity, can be seen in fresh ways from a geographical perspective. Harriet Hawkins is professor of GeoHumanities and the founding co-director of the Center for GeoHumanities at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her current research, as she describes it, focuses on the subsurface as a site of new environmental imaginations and explores the potential of arts and humanities scholarship and practices to both understand and help shape these new imaginations. She is the author of 4 Creative Geographies, Geography, Visual Arts, and the Making of Worlds, which appeared in 2013, and Creativity, a title in the Key Ideas in Geography series 2016, and co-editor of Geographical Aesthetics, appeared in 2014, and Geographies of Making, Craft, and Creativity from 2017. Her most recent monograph exploring practice-based research called Geography, Art, Research, Artistic Research in the GeoHumanities was published 3 years ago in 2020. Her research and collaborations are funded by a range of bodies, including the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, the Leverhulme Trust, British Academy Arts Council, and the National Science Foundations of the US, Switzerland, and China. She is currently serving as the director of TechNA, an Arts and Humanities Research Council doctoral training partnership that supports almost 200 PhD students in the UK. She's also editor of the journal Cultural Geographies and associate editor of GeoHumanities, Space, Place, and the Humanities. While she has appeared everywhere, this is her first time speaking at Stanford, and we are pleased that the Stanford Humanities Center can be the venue that welcomes her here for the first time. Please give a big welcome to our West lecturer for this year, Professor Harriet Hawkins.
Hello, everybody, and I'm sorry I brought the rain with me from London. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you too for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you, Eric, for all your work arranging things, and thank you, of course, to the West family and all who keep this series going. It's a real honor to be included within it. And of course, thank you to you in the room and also online for giving up your time, whatever time of day it is for you, to have me share these ideas with you today. So, imagine. What comes into your head if I ask you to imagine the Earth in 500 years' time? Or even in 5,000 years' time? What about 10,000 years into the past? Do you imagine a future of environmental catastrophe with billionaires living in luxury and bunkers and many millions more climate refugees? Or did we manage to halt climate change somehow and regreen the world? Is your imagination shaped by a Christian eschatology of the second coming and the celebration of the multitudes? Or perhaps by vivid imaginations of worlds sketched by your favorite sci-fi writer, whether utopian or dystopian? Maybe these shape your future worlds. Potentially, it's some mix of all of these and more. What about your imagination of the past? 10,000 years ago, the Earth was just emerging from the freezing grip of an ice age, and agriculture as we know it was just starting to take place. How far back can you imagine before you lose grip on the world might be and what the world might be? Now, even such simplistic imaginative exercises offer us a lens onto how we as individuals and societies frame our worlds and pace and space our lives. Yet it is easy to overlook, to dismiss the formative power of the imagination. One perhaps surprising place the imagination has come to the fore of late is in discussions of environmental crisis. Whilst in the West at least, we're perhaps more used to registering this crisis and its solutions in terms of science and technology, it has become increasingly common for environmental commentators of our day to point to environmental crisis as a crisis of the imagination. This implicates our imaginations as both the cause of environmental concern and also a site for their possible solutions. This is quite a claim. In our time today, I want to have three slightly ambitious aims. Firstly, I'm going to spend some time thinking with this link between environmental crisis and the crisis of the imagination. What does that mean? What does that look like? Secondly, I want to revisit the idea of the imagination itself, the imaginations of imagination, if you will, and think a little bit with this idea of imagination and ambivalence. And thirdly, I want to animate these ideas with examples from the emerging research field of the GeoHumanities, as part of the imaginations of what has been called a new intellectual climate. So the GeoHumanities is, as the name suggests, an area of research that's based on an admixture of geography with arts and humanities research, but also importantly, arts practice. Both arts practice that might exist in gallery spaces in the form of artwork, but also might come into universities in the form of practice-based research. And I want to discuss the GeoHumanities project I'm currently involved in, Think Deep, which explores spaces underground, undersea, and under ice. In doing so, I hope to animate some of the possibilities and also challenges of this link between environment and imagination. So, part one, environmental crisis, a crisis of the imagination. In the opening days of 2023, activist and writer Rebecca Solnit penned a think piece for the UK edition of The Guardian newspaper. It was headlined, "If you win the popular imagination, you change the game. Why we need new stories on climate." It was a part of the promotion for her new editor collection with Thelma Young Latuna Tabor entitled Not Too Late, Changing the Climate Story from Despair to Possibility. Now, Solnit in this article expands her ideas for changing the popular imagination. She writes, "Every crisis is in part a storytelling crisis. This is as true of climate chaos as of anything else. We are hemmed in by stories that prevent us from seeing or believing in or acting on possibilities for change. Some are habits of the mind. Some are industry propaganda. Sometimes the situation has changed, but the stories haven't, and people follow the old versions like outdated maps into dead ends." Now, as a geographer, I'm drawn to that cartographic metaphor. Imaginations as life mappings. Imaginations not only as private in our individual heads, sort of escapes from the material realities of the world, but as integral to individual and collective lives. Solnit and Young Latuna Tabor's take on climate crisis as imaginative crisis foregrounds the possibilities of stories as a particular mode of the imagination. If we currently have the wrong stories of despair, of apocalypse, we might look for other stories of more existing hopeful presents and more livable futures. These might help us shape the popular imagination away from despair and towards possibility. Now, in their call to imagination, they reprise a long link between imagination and social change, figuring it as the first step in, as the slogan goes, making other worlds possible. First, you imagine the world you want, then you bring it about. Or, to borrow a phrase from 1960s radical avant-garde, all power to the imagination. Now, Solnit is, of course, by no means the first to link environmental crisis and the imagination. Amitav Ghosh in 2016 described the cultural aversion artists and writers have had to portraying environmental concerns as the great derangement. Note the date, 2016. Climate crisis is, he writes, quote, "a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination." And he reflects, "Are the currents of global warming too wild to be navigated by the accustomed barks of narration? But the truth, as is now widely acknowledged, is that we've entered a time when the wild has become the norm. If certain literary forms are unable to negotiate these torrents, they will have failed. and certainly their failures should be counted as an aspect of the broader imaginative and cultural failure that lies at the heart of climate crisis. End quote. Now, tracking this formulation of environmental and imaginative crisis leads us to the work of humanities scholar Lawrence Boal, who, writing in 1996 about great American environmental storyteller Thoreau, observed, quote, "With our environmental crisis comes a crisis of the imagination. We need," he continues, "to find new ways to understand nature and humanity's relation with it." End quote. So the imaginative crisis understood here is one predicated on a modern separation of nature and culture, a separation which foregrounds relations based on difference and distance, enabling violence and damage, the argument goes. In place of this separation, desirable imaginations today are based on entanglement and attunement, understood to precipitate relations of empathy and care. Whilst not talking specifically about the environment, philosopher Claire Colebrook suggests the necessary shift in Western human environmental relations is akin to the reckoning brought on by Darwin's theory of evolution. This then is no small challenge. In the 8 years or so since Josh diagnosed the great derangement and cultural aversion, there has been an intensified outpouring of responses which has seized imaginative challenges of climate. I'm sure we've all got our memorable examples of the evolving genre of climate fiction or of renewed forms of eco-art. We also see the growth of arts organisations whose remit is to shape our cultural responses to climate change. And of course, academics from across the environmental and GeoHumanities have produced a range of texts exploring these imaginations and the spatial and temporal challenges of environmental crisis. Importantly, though, it's not just in arts and humanities that we find links between environmental crisis and the imagination, but in science and the wider academy too. Indeed, the crisis in the imaginations of scientists and other academics working on the environment are seen as myriad. Scientists have been accused of a poverty of the imagination, requiring the imagination of new intellectual climates to release us from an experimental myopia that's been restricting our thinking around possible action and solution. In a paper for Nature Climate Change, 22 critical environmental social scientists and humanities scholars asked, quote, "What would global change research look like if critical social sciences and the wider humanities were central to its integrated and actionable ambition? What would the modus operandi of environmental change, science and technology be if everything from cultural anthropology to eco-art was an equal partner in designing projects and disseminating research outputs?" End quote. Stunting the development of this imagination of new knowledge coalitions, which work both beyond disciplinary silos and of course naturally beyond the so-called ivory tower, is another imaginative problem, what has been termed the crisis imagination. This denotes the sense in which the imagination of the scale and urgency of environmental problems is actually limiting action, suspending robust debate and foreclosing the time and space needed for the depth of thought and that would actually enable us to address the issue. Further, and in an echo of Gauche's cultural aversion, it is claimed that scientists too have an aversion to imagining the significance of environmental crisis, and for a long time failed to speak stridently enough, cowed into moderation by political forces. In short then, the imagination and its failures are not just issues for scholars to diagnose in relation to environmental crisis, but importantly, there is, it seems, an imaginative crisis at the heart of the ways the academy has traditionally produced its environmental knowledge making. There is then a lot at stake in these questions of imagination and environment. From Solnit's concern with the need to shape the popular imagination, to Gauche's call to recognise our cultural aversion to imagining crisis, Boal's concern to reimagine the relations of some humans with their environments, and finally calls across the academy to develop nothing short of new imaginations of knowledge up to the task of forging new Earth futures. I do think, though, these claims leave us in the arts and humanities with a responsibility to press in a little harder to these ideas of the imagination, to interrogate our imaginations of imagination, if you will, something that appears to have perhaps been a bit overlooked outside of specialisms like philosophy or the history of science, And it's this that I want to take up next. So, part 2, the imaginations of imagination. On the 28th of May in 1751, an essay on the hazards of definitions appeared in the Rambler, a 2-penny sheet told twice weekly in London. In its opening paragraphs, Samuel Johnson, literary titan of the era, presented the imagination as the apotheosis of a critical object that would, in his terms, embarrass the definer. Imagination, he wrote, a licentious and vagrant faculty, unsusceptible of limitations and impatient of restraint, has always endeavoured to baffle the logician, to perplex the confines of distinction and burst the enclosures of regularity. Johnson sits in a long lineage of those who have identified perhaps one of the more fundamental crises of the imagination, that of definition. To Johnson's vision of imagination as impatient, baffling, perplexing, and bursting, we might add 20th century philosopher Ed Casey's reflection on imagination as mocking the thinker. The root of such mockery lies in imagination's multiple and contradictory understandings. Is it to be diminished, to be understood as mesmeric? As Casey writes, responses over the years have ranged from distrust to disgust, from malevolence to méconnaissance. Whilst at the opposite end of the spectrum, for Edgar Allan Poe, the imagination was the queen of faculties, and for Baudelaire, it was the creator of the world. How then have people handled so vexing and capricious a concept? This is not the place to offer a conceptual history. Others have, of course, tried. Instead, I want to sit with imagination's resistance to conceptual settling, its very capriciousness, its bafflement. For even within the 2 most common imaginations of imagination, imagination diminished and imagination as mesmerizing, we find imagination's vagrancy and mockery at work. Tracking imagination's unsettledness through these 2 ideas raises the possibility of a third imagination of imagination, that of ambivalence. Now, it's the opprobrium of false consciousness, the association with the fictive and the illusionary, that is often the driver of those who diminish imagination's power and force. After all, the argument goes, imagination won't save us, it's all in our heads. Flights of fancy, frivolous fun, escapism with no real world purchase. Such diminishments, of course, have their roots in the ideological communities that shaped modern Western culture's desire to sort human experiences, sorting them into the real and the unreal, and separating the material faculties of a body passionately involved in the world from the dispassionate reasoning of an immaterial rational mind. For many commentators, it's during the European Enlightenment that the imagination really ends up in the doghouse of knowledge. Less, however, due to its diminishment than through what Lorraine Daston has memorably termed science's fear and loathing of the imagination. Indeed, she notes that until around 1830, there was no real opposition of the imagination to science. This changed as both objectivity and the idea of scientific fact hardened, and as imagination was loosened from being understood as subservient to will and to reason. Imagination's subservience was, as Goya's epigraph to this etching makes clear, seen as vital for its proper harnessing, without which it would become dangerous. As long as art and science had shared a common goal of truth to nature, they also shared a code of aesthetic, epistemological, and moral value. Yet, as art became more interested in mystical originality and quasi-divine inspiration, concerns with truth to nature slipped away. Freed from the constraints of verisimilitude, a more darkling, wild form of the imagination emerged. And as practices of science solidified, hearts hardened further to the imagination, shifting from a sense of fear to that of loathing. Driving imagination's loathing in this era was in part its so-called orgy of overestimation by Western European romantic artists, writers, and intellectuals. For the romantics, the imagination was mesmerizing. It had a virtually limitless power. It became situated as the resolving force of many of that era's confrontational ideas, offering the chance to reconcile humans with nature, the subjective with the objective, matter with spirit, the finite with the infinite, the conscious with the unconscious. It enabled relations to be formed between the static and dynamic, passive and active, ideal and real, universal and particular. Powerful stuff indeed. As James Engels, literary professor, observed of the imagination, seldom, quote, has one idea in Western culture so excited so many leading minds for such a stretch of time. It has become an impelling force in artistic and intellectual life, in literature and in philosophy, and even in much political and social thought. It's perhaps no surprise then that we continue to feel the effects of this imagination today. For some, this manifests in enduring divisions between science and art, in the division of artistic practice from mimetic representation. For others, it offers a foundational idea that secular art could fabricate new world views, including, of course, evolving new relations between humans and nature. The promise and burden of these romantic expectations continues today. Indeed, we can trace the inheritances of the mesmeric imagination into the faith Solnit and others put in imagination and their disappointment at its failures. How, though, can we respond? Should we adopt a measured tone, shake our heads and assert imagination's limits, reprising its diminishment or even its fear and loathing? After all, the environmental crisis is a serious business. Or should we embrace imagination's optimism, joy and possibility, and risk in doing so getting carried away in a neo-romantic orgy of imagination's overestimation? I think, though, in both the histories and contemporary usage, we can find a third way, that of ambivalence. Crucially, what I mean by ambivalence here is not the ambivalence of a shoulder shrug, the affective orientation of the I just can't quite be bothered, what's been written of as ambivalence tilting negative. Nor, of course, is ambivalence in this case indifference, the flat affect of disinterestedness, the lack of feeling or a non-relation. Rather, I'm interested in ambivalence here as a means to hold negative and positive in dynamic interplay, a refusal to settle out into fixed propositions. What, wonders Lauren Ballant, might it mean, quote, to return ambivalence to its dynamic etymology as being strongly mixed, drawn in many directions, positively and negatively charged? Can we nudge the imagination away from being understood only on a positive-negative axis, either mesmerizing or overlooked, loathed or diminished? Does ambivalence offer us the means to sit with that sense of imagination's baffling, perplexing, mocking nature? Ambivalence requires us to stay with the trouble of indeterminacy, to remain, as Anna Secord and Jeff Lintz put it, elbow deep in the disconcerting experience of the irresolution of complexity, to keep open divergent pulls, keeping different kinds of relations with objects on the table. Interestingly, though, ambivalence is actually not a novel imagination of imagination, even if it's not really named as such. A select group of imagination's definers have long found in it the means to sit with its perplexing form and tension rather than seek resolution. Early Enlightenment thinker Spinoza offers us one sense of the imagination and ambivalence when he situates and identifies a Janus-faced imagination in the midst of his political treatise. He observes, nothing governs the multitude so effectively, whilst also observing it's easy for people to become captivated, difficult to ensure they remain loyal. Spinoza's is an embodied imagination, a form of bodily awareness of our own and other, not always human bodies. Imagination for Spinoza is unreal in and of itself, but it's not simply false. Instead, it's that by which there can be falsity. Beings of the imagination, Spinoza observed in a wonderfully ambivalent phrase, are nothing more and nothing less than that by which there are patterns of continuity and trans-individuation, but no guarantee these collective patterns will endure. Thinking with the imagination makes sense through ambivalence, makes space too for further complexity. It offers space for the always present other to imagination's possibilities. For paired with evolving new imaginations is, of course, the ever-present need to navigate our existing ones. The imagination has, of course, long been associated with power and political violence. We find this in Benedict Anderson's explorations of nations as imagined communities, and Edward Said's Orientalism, with its account of the role of Western imaginations of Oriental culture and their role in the production and reproduction of imperial power. Indeed, we find the imagination in many of the social struggles of our time today, articulated as imagination battles. Writer and activist Adrienne Maree Brown, for example, writes of how entrenched racist imaginations render some bodies and lives less livable. She writes, "I often feel I am trapped inside someone else's imaginations, and I must engage my own imagination in order to break free." For Gabrielle M.W. Buczynski, imagination stories is how we, by which they mean trans folks, find ways of functioning, ways of making connections, getting from yesterday to tomorrow. Both then direct us importantly to the ambivalence at the heart of the imagination. It's both that which can set us free, but also that which can do violence and keep us trapped. Humanities scholar Lauren Ballant also attunes us to the importance of approaching imagination with ambivalence. In their important account of national sentiment, a number of imaginations emerge, perhaps most memorably, the American dream of the good life. Their account of the cruel optimism of the good life skewers it as both something many millions continue to aspire to, a stable home, a job, car, kids, holidays, even while in the pursuit of what was once so achievable and normal is damaging in its ever-receding possibility. Of course, for many, it never was possible to begin with. Even as Ballant diagnoses the cruelty, the attritional nature of ongoing optimistic attachments to such good life imaginations, there are, they note, still possibilities for flourishing. People and organisations committed to trying to imagine and bring about other futures. Reflecting on imagination and change, they observe lyrically, "You have to imagine the world you could promise, the world that could be seductive, the world you could induce people to want to leap into. But leaps," they continue, "are awkward. They're not actually that beautiful. When you land, you're probably going to fall or hurt your ankle or hit someone." Being able to summon new worlds then is only part of bringing about change. And we need to recognise this is not always easy. It's awkward, risky, and fraught. Putting the practices of imagining change another way, Ballant expands. Imagining a better world than that exists involves narrating from the granular ordinary ways to unlearn, to loosen objects and structures that might otherwise seem intractable. Thinking imaginations with ambivalence, then, requires we attend to both the positive and negative possibilities of their force, but also importantly, it asserts the often overlooked aspect of the imagination, that it is double work. In other words, there's a need to both imagine the future we want to leap into, but also to enable that leap through unloosening and unlearning everyday ordinary habits of mind, sometimes overlooked, that keep us all tethered in existing imaginations, sometimes at great cost. To turn back now then to questions of the environment and the imagination, and think these further through the question of ambivalence. So, part 3, a leap, imagining new intellectual climates, or interdisciplinarity from the mesmeric to the ambivalent. The imaginative project of the environment I want to explore here is the GeoHumanities project Think Deep I've been working on for the last few years. Now, Think Deep has quite deliberately 2 bold aims, which are also, to use Ballant's language, 2 interlinked but distinct imaginative leaps. First, it's an attempt to study existing environmental imaginations and to produce new ones, specifically here of spaces underground, undersea, and under ice. As such, we study and critique existing imaginations of the subsurface, from Western ideas of hell to what Marie-Maloise Zerta termed the sub-terra nullius, which has enabled planners and corporations to see the subsurface as a tabula rasa, an effectively empty space awaiting their use. We've also been building on these to try to imagine these spaces anew. The second imaginative leap at Think Deep's heart is a desire to respond to those wider imaginative fails of science and the academy discussed earlier, the fails to model, to create research worlds up to the task of tackling environmental crisis. To return to that exchange in the journal Nature Climate Change that I mentioned earlier. Here, the 22 scholars called for a resistance to the crisis imagination, with its need to act immediately and act now, and made the case for slower, more considered remakings of our intellectual climates. You can, as they note, Either join the large multidisciplinary choir, now giving voice to the ailments and demands of our planet, or you can seek to change its composition and communication towards more diverse and creative ends. What they summon here is the need to replace the imagination of inter, trans, or cross post-disciplinarity, pick your phrase, as an additive practice. In other words, to move away from a practice where adding one discipline after another together helps us build a more granular, more complete understanding. Instead, they imagine a changed intellectual climate, a new knowledge contract that goes beyond just inviting more and more disciplines to the table, but actually enables their understandings and practices of knowledge itself to change how we do things. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this room who's witnessed the university and beyond being mesmerized by the imagined possibilities of working beyond our disciplinary silos. Yet, like many of us, we also witness what Felix Guattari once memorably termed transdisciplinarity's abracadabra effect. The sense of it as a gesture, a theoretical and rhetorical flourish, a sleight of hand. Now, the project Think Deep emerged in the midst of creative and intellectual stuckness and frustration with what seemed to be the abracadabra effects of environmental knowledge making. In some areas, it works really well, but working across science, social science, and arts and humanities together seems more challenging. There are lots of claims made to interdisciplinarity, but little seems to actually change. Now, Think Deep was conceived at a time and a place then of intellectual stuckness, and we wanted to enable the time, space, and funds to experiment with what such an imagined intellectual climate could look like. How could we fund artists, creative writers, dancers, and so on to come and work in the academy through residencies? And how could we draw together academics and practitioners from very different fields to explore the subsurface together? Think Deep's current iteration involves 5 years of funding for interdisciplinary experiments. This has allowed me to assemble a group of scholars and artists from across geography, visual arts and art history, creative writing, linguistics, geoscience, and curating. Our collaborators include a range of subsurface practitioners, including other artists, curators, shamans and spiritual elders, communities of small-scale artisanal mining families, as well as architects, urban planners, engineers, and geoscientists. To elaborate, I'm going to outline 2 interdisciplinary arts-based research projects we're currently working on within the team. One experiments with the imagination of human environmental relations based on magma, seismicity, and millennia-long subsurface sensing practices. And another considers the conflicting imaginations at the heart of Singapore's subsurface urban futures. As a team, we try to negotiate being mesmerized by the exciting possibilities of composing new environmental imaginations from the subsurface, and by the research worlds we're trying to practice, and balance this with the realities of doing this work in the context of existing imaginations and practices within and beyond the academy. So, art science practitioner Wayne Chambliss is developing what he calls a geophysical arts practice. This is based in collaborations with earthly matter and forces of magma, gravity, and seismicity, in performances that include digging, burrowing, burying, and spoofing at sites from the deserts of the American Southwest to the seismically active Italian supervolcano of the Campi Flegrei. Artistically, the work is inspired by earth and land art traditions and their vociferous critiques by feminists and others. Scientifically, it is inspired by Wayne's human collaborators, including a group of physical geographers specialized in volcanoes and their ejecta, and a series of data scientists working on projects evolving new hardware and software for data visualization. To shape his site-specific works, as well as produce erstwhile records of these collaborations, Wayne enrolls Earth monitoring practices from across millennia. At his current site in Italy, this involves ground-penetrating radar, seismicity and photogrammetry of this potentially explosive and lethal supervolcano site. But it also involves engaging with the region's long association with the divine subsurface sensing practices, including the oracular practices of the Cumean Sibyl, a local cave-dwelling prophetess and guide to Hades, the underworld, accessed through a nearby crater of Avernus, which leads us straight to hell. In one of the area's many ancient descent stories, Aeneas employed the Sibyl's services to visit his dead father Anchises in the lower world. To descend was easy, to retrace your steps far more of a challenge. And it's from, of course, such stories that classical Western subsurface imaginations of the katabatic journey of descent, challenge, and return has emerged. One way to appreciate the imagination of Wayne's practices is to situate them as a response to the call by Buell and others for new imaginations to shape Western humanities' relation to the environment. Of particular relevance here is the imaginative challenge of the Anthropocene, and its assertion of the human history within vast geological time spaces, which poses the need, as sociologist Bron Cesarinski describes, to, quote, reimagine the relations across the planet between humans and non-humans, and recompose the lived time of human history and the deep time of our home planet. From such imaginations, we might bring new Earth futures. Wayne's place-sensitive performances of geophysical processes, such as magma movements or earthquakes and other seismic activity, occurs at scales, spatial and temporal, that make them legible to humans. This is of most value to those of us who live lives in which the matter and force of the subsurface are out of sight, often overlooked parts of the regimes of extraction which prop up our lives. Wayne's geophysical art practice also dramatizes the ambivalence at work in the imagination through his refusal of a single knowledge form as dominant. He holds in play diverse subsurface imaginations summoned by the feminist oracular practices and by cutting-edge technologies with a desire to empirically render the subsurface, ideally to predict its volatile forces and save lives. Of course, conflicts within imagination are not unique to this location. And Think Deep team member Will Jameson is experimenting with a geoliterary creative writing practice as a means to explore the tensions within the subsurface, past, present, and imagined futures of Singapore. The inability to imagine these futures he conceptualizes as plot holes. His work takes place against the backdrop of the powerful Singaporean imagination of itself as a space-strapped island nation bent on overcoming environmental challenges through vast terraforming ambition. Combining an ethnographic research practice and a creative writing practice, Will is working with local artists and Indigenous groups, as well as consulting with planners, engineers, and scientists to reflect on the ways the Singaporean subsurface is imagined and enacted. His ethnographic work with a range of stakeholders associated with the Singaporean state explored their imaginations of what the urban underground Singapore could look like. Key for these architects, engineers, and planners was not only the challenges of imagining building forms and functions proper to the subsurface, but also to help evolve the subsurface as an aspirational place to live. As sci-fi scholars and gamers have pointed out, whilst outer space, looking up, is often associated with aspirational utopian possibilities, the subsurface is more often a site of dystopian nightmares. Spaces underground, undersea, and under ice are where the unknown lies. In wait, where you can be trapped in the dark and damp, crushed, claustrophobic, and too close to hell for comfort. Yet the subsurface is a key site for new sources of energy, as well as identified the world over as our final urban frontier. As well as confronting conflicts between existing imaginations and those imaginations of desirable futures, Will is also interested in whose imaginations get written out of future subsurface concerns. Those thrown off their land to make way for Singapore's reclamation project, those whose seashore homes are now miles inland, and those whose lives lived on the depths, on and in the depths, surfaces, and edges of waters are now radically changed. What too of the imaginations of those Cambodians several thousand miles across the ocean, whose riverside homes are crumbling away as the illegal extraction of sand to Singapore continues? Will is working through the creation of a speculative fiction for future subsurface Singapore, which will draw into dialogue without seeking to settle these conflicting subsurface imaginations, giving presence to those imaginations that are often quite literally overlooked by the state. Now, scholars of science and technology have recently proposed the idea of socio-technical imaginations as a valuable way to think through futures more generally, understanding them as, quote, collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology, end quote. As such, then, whilst the interdisciplinary workings of both Will and Wayne's experiments with imagination hold much promise, they bind with them challenges too. Sitting with imagination's ambivalence, we're reminded of the importance of querying whose imaginations are growing stronger, gaining power and durability, being stabilized, and whose might be diminished and overlooked. What are the geographies and histories of any imaginative crisis? Is it a secular Western crisis whose effects are being felt elsewhere? And whose imaginations are being posed as a solution? Where might we seek alternative, already existing imaginations, other perhaps than Western science and technology? I want to turn now to the second leap that Think Deep tries to make, that of imagining new research worlds in the context of those debates that press for, quote, a change in the intellectual climate of our research, end quote. The team at Think Deep were excited by the possibilities of that leap, to return to that wonderful description of imagination change from Berlant. But we had perhaps failed to appreciate the double work of the imagination. For despite institutional promises of buy-in to our experimental approaches of working beyond discipline and collaborating with practitioners beyond the academy, that leap into an imagined research future sometimes felt tethered to the ground of institutional norms that kept us wanting to work in understood and disciplined ways. It was in the seemingly small things that these norms showed up. Patterned common sense, foundational to the management and regulation of our collective institutional research life. The nuts and bolts and bitty annoyances of practices which emerged as frictions, almost but not quite incidental to our research process. Frictions between us and the ways the universities and funders thought our research should be happening. Research works, artworks, like Wayne's geophysical practice, for example, don't have digital object identifiers. They don't easily find their way into journals, and thus can't find their way onto output recording forms, causing issues with timesheeting, finance, and citation. Various administrative practices for PhDs and postdocs create a kind of regulative gaslighting, a tension between the apparent welcome of practice-based research and its simultaneous thwarting. Various documents and evaluative processes, from proposals to ethics, pretend the differences in interdisciplinary ways of working don't exist. Not a big deal, perhaps just some paperwork, but actually small and large frictions that add up to the continual practice of negotiation. In other parts of the project, baffled contract lawyers tried and failed to wrestle university IP agreements into forms adequate to artistic and creative practice, let alone into forms appropriate for creative outputs co-produced with communities. HR staff displayed incredible patience as time and again contract forms and our needs, a day of carving, a workshop, a performance piece that no, we didn't own, and a residency whose outputs we couldn't specify in advance. None of these fell easily into the patterns of work an institution want to see, or could sometimes even work out how to code as legal. Patience, bafflement, reprimands, gritted teeth, the attritional processes of never really fitting in despite institutional commitments to these new imagined ways of working. Sometimes the constant work and play of resisting, deterring, composing and critiquing was a delight and a point of learning for all of us. Sometimes it was something we tried to shrug off with a sigh, some extra emails and a glass of wine at the end of the day. For some members of the team, this is an experience of paddling hard to keep afloat in institutional, interdisciplinary contexts that made us constantly feel out of our depth. This then is the double work of the imagination. Imagining a better research world than that could exist involves, as Berlant noted, engaging with the granular ordinary ways to unlearn and loosen objects and structures that might otherwise seem intractable. As the project develops, we're trying not to paper over the gaps between these new imaginations of knowledge and the pacing, spacing, and practices of institutional life. Instead, we're trying to understand these challenges as a nudge towards ambivalence, akin to Sarah Ahmed's urging us to resist the impulse to tidy our texts and our concepts, not to try to hide the struggles we have in getting somewhere. So, to return to where we began, the link between environmental crisis and the imagination, and ask, where does bringing imagination with ambivalence get us? Firstly, I hope you agree, imagination matters with respect to environmental crisis. From Solnit's concern with the need to reshape the popular imagination, to Ghosh's calls to recognise our cultural aversion to imagining crisis, its scales and scope. Boyle's concern to reimagine the relations of some humans with their environments. And finally, calls across the academy to develop nothing short of new imaginations of knowledge up to the task of forging new Earth futures. If imagination matters, it matters how we understand this concept. And thinking imagination and ambivalence together offers, I think, a better way to appreciate the complexities of imagination's mattering. To embrace the imagination's ambivalence is to find ways to sit with the potential of imagined futures that is not mono-affective, to recognise the importance, but also the challenge of both imagination's diminishment and its mesmeric potential. It's also to appreciate that imaginations that might inspire, enable, and intensify life for some erode, diminish, and silence others. Ambivalence offers the possibilities to neither kill nor hold in check that enthusiasm for imagination's potential, but to be able to summon instead at the same time imagination's possibilities and ever-present potential for violence. To develop an imagination of imagination marked by ambivalence is secondly, I think, to appreciate its double work. In other words, if one task is to imagine the better worlds, the more just environmental futures we want to leap into, the better human environmental relations we hope will get us there through cultivation of empathy and care. Then paired with this leap is the work of untethering, of unlearning and loosening us from ingrained imaginative patterns of everyday life. This is a pairing of leap and loosened tether that is not only awkward and ungainly, but can also make us vulnerable, unmoored and out of our depth. It can be uncomfortable then, but if we only fixate on the form and kinds of new imaginations, the delight in the possible worlds we want to bring about, and overlook the need to unlearn the current imaginations, it seems, to reprise Solnit's cartographic metaphor, we might continue with our old map to the same dead ends. Thirdly, imagining imagination by way of ambivalence, rather than being either too much in imagination's thrall or too dismissive of it, signposts, I think, a valuable knowledge politics apt for times of environmental crisis. Ambivalence and its refusal of the ease of settling insists that we sit with complexity. In refusing the singular definitional perspective, ambivalence cedes sovereignty and mastery of an issue with significant effect. For if it is at the door of the hubris of science and technology, rather than with their moves to master, fix, tame, and exhaust their subjects, that we can lay some of our current environmental crisis, we need other kinds and ways of knowing. The risk in being mesmerized by the imagination and what the Romantics found as its unifying possibilities is that we simply replace one definitive statement, science, with another one, the imagination. The ambivalent imagination, always baffled even by itself, however, refuses such a settlement, and with it the sense of mastery inherent within it. Ambivalent imaginations there are humble propositions, perhaps more apt for the complexities and uncertainties of environmental crisis. To be left with ambivalence in relation to an object is, as Seacole and Lintz note, to be left feeling multiplicities about it. It's not to feel autonomy, but to learn to relate to it in multiple manners. An imagination of imagination's ambivalent requires the giving way to entanglement with the object, imagination, in multiple ways. It's to recognize both the potential of the imagination in the face of environmental crisis, but also that the imagination will never be reparable, conclusive, or safe. The imagination situated as part of environmental crisis, or indeed of other struggles, requires double work. It's both the seduction of the imagined future, the leap towards, as well as the everyday ongoing work of untethering us from our ordinary imaginations that pattern our lives. These might be overlooked, they might be violent, but they're very present. All power then to ambivalent imaginations. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Sorry, I will now take questions. And Roland, I believe you're going to have an iPad for anything.
I'm going to have an online questions, but
yeah.
First questions from people in the room.
Hi.
Thanks, Chris. As you know, Gauche answers vessels with imaginations and geographies quite a bit more than he did in the earlier work that you referenced. I just wondered where your imaginaries and geographies interact with indigenous imaginaries and geographies.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think one of the points for me as a geographer about the imagination is the need to always be aware of the kind of questions around the geographies and histories of those imagination, and that one way to think through some of the kinds of ways of thinking about the challenges that we think about in terms of Western environmental imaginations is that obviously there are other imaginations of the environment from other places in the world that offer us perhaps richer possibilities and solutions to some of the kinds of crises that many have laid at the door of the modern Western separation. So in terms of the kind of need to think through those geographies of imagination, very much so. In terms of where my own work touches on indigenous imaginations of the environment, the work that Will's been doing in Singapore, and I've been doing some paired work in Cambodia, has been working very particularly with different imaginations of indigenous groups who live in water-based communities. So live, for example, in the work I'm doing in Cambodia on the Tonle Sap Lake, which is a seasonal lake that expands and contracts rapidly and vastly every season. People who boat communities who live on the lake oftentimes live with sort of on the surface of the water, but then as the lake recedes, they live on the earth. So it's a very different sort of intersection, very different understanding of the kind of the environment and the imaginations of wet and dry, of shallow and deep that exist there. So we're thinking that through and working with artists to engage with the sorts of different kinds of everyday patternings of those environmental imaginaries in different kinds of ways. Thanks. Hi.
Do you have a special way of untethering from previous imagination? Oops, sorry, testing. Do you have a special way of untethering from previous opinions?
That's a really great question. I think the way that I like to tether is by surrounding myself with collaborators and kind of whether they're sort of, you know, academics from other kind of parts of the university or practitioners from other kinds of areas. So working with artists, working with geoscientists, working with people who work in data visualization, you know, kind of disrupting my own kind of patterned norms of the ways that I work becomes a way in which I kind of help keep things in play. But I think that's a really fantastic question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I want to put a bit of, I want to push a bit on the concept of ambivalence. And I wanted to ask, who is not ambivalent? Who needs to be more ambivalent? You know, is it people like Ghosh, Heisa, Nixon that you're thinking of? So, I mean, so the question of who, and then the other question is ambivalence going to make a new map? Because that's part of what you're asking for. Or is it one way we could respond to say ambivalence is going to allow us to think about the complexities of the current map and feelings in it more deeply, but does it make a new one? So I want to know how from ambivalence we get to new maps, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thanks. So I think who is ambivalent? I think I mean, in the context of climate crisis more generally, obviously none of us want to be ambivalent. We should all be very engaged. But in terms of who is ambivalent, in terms of the imagination, I think one of the things I found when working through all these different texts and trying to hold the ways that they worked with the imagination, the question of what they meant by the imagination was often short-circuited and proposed as basically, it was a shorthand for cultural production. and a shorthand for what kind of creative practice could potentially do in different kinds of contexts. It could create these new imaginations. And that felt really great, but it didn't allow me to sit in a more complex way with the question of what the imagination was and what did that mean, especially when coming from other sets of practitioners, what other kinds of imaginations, like the socio-technological imaginations. So it seemed like we had all these conflicting imaginations doing different kinds of work. There was a need to, within the idea of the imagination, hold together its possibilities and also its challenges. And sometimes a lot of those challenges felt like they got written out, that actually there were the negative imaginations, but that the imagination that might be positive for some people was doing violence to others, or was holding people in particular kind of patterns, was not necessarily articulated. So I went looking for an understanding of the imagination that might help me think through that as a concept, as an operation more clearly. And ambivalence seemed to enable the kind of toing and froing of all that was possible with the imagination, but all that it was that was challenged by it, and all the reasons people found to dismiss it or diminish it, as well as the kind of negative imaginations themselves. As to whether or not ambivalent imaginations give us new maps, I think they do, but I think they bring with them the questions of what those maps might be. And so as a geographer, for me, maps can have a certain kind of, they come laden with lots and lots of baggage, lots of kind of colonial baggage, lots of baggage of particular kinds of knowledge making. And a scholar who I particularly like to use when I think about maps is Dennis Cosgrove, who wrote the idea of mappings as kinds of more humble, tentative possibilities that enabled space for lots of different perspectives. And I think in thinking through imagination's ambivalences, I find something more akin to mappings, perhaps, rather than a kind of solidity of something like a map, if that makes sense. Thank you. Hi, at the back in the great yellow sweater.
Hi, sorry. Thank you for the talk. This is wonderful. I have a question, less as an academic than as a kind of ordinary citizen person. Obviously, a lot of the talk had to do with specialized production of knowledge and its eventual connection to decision making. But there's this other side where you talk about rubric assaulting and sort of the popular imagination. And as someone who has a step on both types of imagination, when you ask the question of how I would imagine the world in 500 years, I felt completely disarmed. And the reason for that is that I just feel that I don't have enough knowledge of anything at all to have a very concrete vision of the world, besides a very dreary one. And that this may be just a matter of personal responsibility on my side, but at the same time, I guess there's a question between specialized and popular knowledge, and how the knowledge or the lack of knowledge may inform of creating the possibility of having a shared imagination that's not just, let's say, scholarly, but also in the street, I guess. I guess the question I'm trying to ask is how do you see the gaps that exist between popular knowledge and specialized knowledge, and how does that poses different challenges for imagination? That's a question.
That's great, thanks. I think one of the risks I have in thinking about some of these questions is I have a mesmeric imagination of what I would like to see happen, I guess. And I think one of the things I think is really fascinating is where, I guess to use an example, so some of the projects that we're working with, one of the projects I've been working with for a while in Switzerland, for example, thinks through how to understand climate futures in Switzerland by understanding that in order to understand climate futures in Switzerland, they have to bring in the knowledge of local communities and farmers who've been farming that land for generations and have been observing change in crops, observing change in soil structure, observing, basically kind of doing sort of, collecting their own knowledge basis, their kind of lay knowledge about the environment. And so one of the ways I think we can think through how we might think about future imaginations is what kinds of knowledge go into making those, and how do we make space for all those different forms of knowledge to kind of come together and produce something that lets us kind of play around with some of that, because some of the kinds of forms of knowledge we've got so far haven't necessarily got us anywhere that great. Thank you.
Harriet, I wonder if I could ask a couple of questions from the remote audience. First is this one. Can you share an example? This goes back to Monique's question a moment ago about ambivalence. Can you share an example of what the double work of working with ambivalent imaginations might look like? Is there a specific example from any projects or creative practice where this double work had to be done?
Great. So thanks for the question. I think what I was trying to do in the second part of the talk was kind of amplify and discuss some of that double work. So for example, when Will is trying to think through how as a creative writer and as a geographer, he can talk to Indigenous communities, he can talk to architects, he can talk to urban planners working in Singapore about what they imagine to be the kind of features of the Singaporean subsurface. He's trying to work out ways to bring all these different kinds of imagination together. But what he then has to, so that's one part of the work. He's trying to kind of pull together all those different forms of knowledge to imagine that kind of leap into the future that they're trying to make in Singapore, but to do so collectively. But then the sort of double work, the kind of the other part of that is that actually in doing so, he has to work through with those different communities how to help them kind of untether, how to kind of break down the existing imaginations that are going on there. So the imaginations of some of the state planners that maybe they don't care so much about the experiences of the communities who've been living by the water in Singapore for generations because they want to reclaim that land for the kind of new part of the state, or the kind of need that the architects and urban planners have to try and render the subsurface not as this negative, dark, damp space, but that actually they need to try and work out how they could possibly persuade people to live underground. And so, yeah, you have to kind of loosen us from those existing sets of imagination. And that's a kind of problem that we've been encountered. Well, that's a problem that's the urban planners who we've spoken to in lots of different locations around the world have spoken of, that actually they see the underground as this final urban frontier, but that actually they can't work out how to get anyone to do anything down there for good or bad measures. And so one of the things to work through is how to change those kinds of imaginations. Thanks.
Thank you. Before we go back to the people in the room, let me ask, I'm going to put together two questions from two different people because it seems to me they are in a way complementary. One is sort of philosophical question and one is more of a kind of practical cultural question. Whether stories are hopeful or hopeless, how important is it to social well-being that they are grounded in truth and facts? And the second question is, how can society retake our individual and collective imaginations from the dominance of media and advertising?
Sorry, could you repeat the first one? Is that too late now? Oh no, it's okay. I think I've got it. Was it yeah.
Whether stories are hopeful or hopeless, how important is it to social well-being that they're grounded in truth and facts?
How important is it to health and well-being, to hope and well-being?
To social well-being.
To social well-being.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a place for the stories, hopeful and hopeless, that are not grounded right now in truth and facts, because I think we can think of science fiction for a very long time has been something that has been about, you know, expanding our kinds of imaginations in ways that we do not think of as possible. And there's all those kind of great examples of where science fiction has kind of imagined something and then science and technology has kind of worked to bring it about. There are also obviously quite a lot of discussions of how science fiction is in fact embedded in kind of facts and reality in different kinds of ways. So I think there's some kind of terms to keep kind of circulating around there. I think also, you know, I think I'll stop there with that one. But I think that it is important. It's not always, they shouldn't always be, but depending on the status we give those stories and the kinds of ways we frame them, sometimes it's incredibly important that they obviously are. I'm thinking in particular about some of the stories that we've been telling of the artisanal subsurface miners we've been working with in Cambodia. We've been thinking through the use of kind of different forms of creative practice as ways not to render their stories of lives visible, because while the NGOs we work with want desperately to know the kind of existence of the lives and conditions under which these artisanal miners are working, if we make them too visible, they then become open to kind of removal from the land, which then becomes rendered valuable. So there's questions there of exactly how much truth we want to tell in those stories and how much we want to kind of play with what narrative and fiction can enable us to do in terms of storytelling that enables us to present conditions of lives lived without telling too much truth, if that makes sense. And so the second question, how do we retake the popular imagination from the kind of media? Yeah. Hopefully through a whole range of different strategies that we might do, to come back to the kind of question at the back there, things that might be about different kinds of knowledge we might pull in to our imaginations. I would perhaps unsurprisingly make a very strong case for different kinds of creative and artistic practices as ways of opening up and kind of stretching our imaginations and offering new kinds of imagination. And I think we can think of some of the kind of ways that activist groups and kind of practices like COP have kind of captured imagination through doing things like dragging large snowballs into kind of major cities to kind of really bring into the kind of present vision, bring into our sort of everyday ordinary urban spaces the kind of very dramatic melting stories. There's a number of examples of artists doing really fascinating things with kind of hydrophones and glaciers and mobile phones, so you can phone up and hear a glacier melt. So there's all these kinds of ways that some of these kinds of imaginations can be brought into our kind of everyday lives that perhaps doesn't tackle some of the questions that are the issues of scale that are perhaps implicit in that question about kind of media. Obviously, there's a kind of scale and dominance there. And there's been quite a lot of work on kind of Hollywood disaster films and the way that they obviously kind of have such an important power and role in shaping the kind of ways that people think about climate and its futures. So, you know, perhaps different sorts of kind of collaborative working that kind of meet some of those kinds of practices where there are. There's some amazing scholars at the moment doing work around video games and environmental imaginations. And obviously video games is one of those kinds of really popular contemporary media that's reaching huge amounts of people in different sorts of audiences that might be kind of not necessarily going to galleries to see artworks, for example. And I think some of those kinds of spaces are also really interesting spaces to be thinking these questions through.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to sort of piggyback off of that last question, and I think also go back to Monique's question from a little while ago, and really sort of, I think, ask what role technology plays in this sort of constellation that you're drawing between the environment and the imagination. And I was especially struck in your first few slides where, you know, of course, there were sort of different types of images. You have the, you know, the book cover, but these were all also digital images in different senses. So I'm wondering in what, and so I'm wondering, so just something that for me is like really hard to square in sort of questions that I ask is sort of to what extent does this disruption of the everyday emerge also as symptomatic of a certain sort of media environment, and sort of where technology sort of comes to play in these questions of, because, you know, there is this sort of everyday doing nothing about the environment and we need an imagination, but then like when questions about technology emerge, I find sometimes it's a different story of like actually, you know, the imagination and needing to be flexible is sort of like we're in the land of like where that's ideology. So I'm just curious how sort of like what role specifically technology sort of plays in this relationship that you're developing between the environment and imagination.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a fascinating question, and one that also kind of works because of the way that we see on the one hand the kind of techno-utopianism of certain kinds of forms of sci-fi, but at the same time the kind of laying of climate crisis at the door of a kind of rampant out of control technology that hasn't yet been kind of harnessed in the right kinds of directions. So I think we can kind of see through a reprise of kind of many different ways that people have talked about technology kind of in the past and multiple different forms of sources. I think where where I found it really interesting to think through technology is in the kind of the work by Janisov and Kim, where they're talking about socio-technological imaginaries as these kinds of stabilized national sets of identities. And they use examples of things like kind of nuclear power as ways of thinking through how nations can stabilize around certain kinds of imaginations of technologies that in other contexts and other places and other eras may be seen as incredibly damaging. And again, partly what's very interesting for me about the way they work there is there's a lot of future orientedness about the way they're thinking about those technologies. So they're always almost good. They've been stabilized by groups to be doing certain kinds of work for the good collective shared futures. What doesn't tend to happen quite so much is some of the things we've been finding talking to the sort of the people who are trying to find new technologies to live underground is actually that you might have those technologies, but actually they can't be, you get held back by these everyday imaginations of the underground as a horrible place. So you might be able to build this amazing bunker with this window that looks like you're actually outside, but everyone knows that you're actually underground and no one wants to be there. So these kind of wonderful ways, there's this kind of fascinating interplay between the kinds of kind of culturally held imaginaries of the subsurface and these kind of cutting edge technologies that are trying really hard to deny that you're not underground, but you are. So it's a way of kind of talking around your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this fascinating talk. And I was wondering about the relationship between imagination and activism, because you talked about imagination of the ambivalent and this refusing of setting up ideas and opening multiplicities. But at the same time, there seems to be a sense of urgency that coming from the sacrifice zones, that there is no time. And the answer is simple: business as usual cannot continue. So how can these two ideas of imagination and activism be combined to how can we work with that to work with this sense of urgency that things happen or transformation has to happen now, but at the same time to open to this multiplicity that you are talking about? Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a really fascinating tension that you've pulled out there. I think one of the things that I was struck by when I was thinking back through and trying to track the kind of antecedents of Solness and others kind of calls for the imagination as kind of being the thing that will save us, or, you know, if we can just change the popular imagination, we'll be there, was to track that back through into the kind of activist kind of harnessing of the imagination in the 1960s in Europe, and the way that the kind of imagination, the kind of the possibility of kind of that would be what would free us. That would be where the power, if we could take back the imagination, we could take back power. So I think that's a really kind of old formulation that works in really, really interesting ways. As to how I think we see, I find it really difficult to think through those questions about the kind of crisis imagination, because we see, and I think we all saw in COVID-19, the power of the crisis imagination. Like very quickly, governments around the world could kind of lock into and get entire populations motivated around, this is a crisis now. You know, I know we all had different kinds of lockdowns, but in the UK, the government managed to sort of summon the collective imagination of the nation to stay at home. That was a really interesting kind of mobilization of if it's a crisis enough, that can be mobilized. So I think, you know, there's so much power in doing that it's kind of intriguing that for all the talk of it as an environmental crisis, it hasn't quite kind of been pulled together yet. So I think there is some kind of still some interesting things there to think through around the kind of temporalities of imagination and crisis in those kinds of terms. And I kind of am always quite interested. I'm not a scholar of activism. But I'm always very interested when I kind of look across the ways that activist groups have enrolled contemporary art practice, which is something I do work a lot more with, and the ways that that's happened in large, bold, spectacular kind of, you know, harnessings of, you know, big kind of dramatic events that really are about the now and the kind of urgency, but then also the ways that the kind of temporalities of other kinds of ways of doing activism is much kind of slower and about different kinds of relationship building through, you know, shared sensing practices that kind of may enable communities to kind of gather their own environmental data, for example. So I think, you know, the kinds of complex temporalities of activism probably intersects there with the kind of questions of emergency, crisis, and those kinds of imaginaries. Thank you.
Hi. Oh my God. Thank you for a great talk. I want to ask about one of the most powerful imaginary things in our world, which is money. So I'm thinking especially about how both like financing, especially like academic work, both sort of constrains and sets what the imaginary and imagination for a field and for a project would be, and how we kind of, if we want to imagine things otherwise, we also kind of have to imagine our funding sources and our finances otherwise.
Yeah.
Just to do a bit more background here, I'm thinking especially in the sciences about like Naomi Oreskes' work about how so much of what we know about the ocean was dictated by the ways the US military funded it, and our outlook on the ocean and its environment is shaped by those funders. And going back to the previous question about activism too, like how a specific struggle right here at Stanford now is about whether a school for sustainability should be accepting fossil fuel money because of the ways that that will constrain and set the imaginations of environmental scientists. So first, just kind of broadly, what do you think about, I guess you could call them like financial imaginaries or imaginations about financing intellectual work as an important sort of focus of activity on the environmental imagination, and maybe an important pressure point? And two, kind of, you got to this, and this was so fascinating, specifically in your experience in the Think Deep project. How are you trying to imagine like different ways of funding interdisciplinary research that can, you know, change the imaginary, change the imagination about these problems in your own project? Thank you.
Thanks. Fascinating question, and so many ways to take the kind of question around the kind of funding and finance and money, and yeah, the kind of the implications we all have within the ways our institutions get their money are yeah, complex and myriad. I'm in the midst of a pensions and work strike in my own institution, which is partly about divestment of pension funds from kind of different kinds of, you know, fossil fuel kinds of, yeah, different kinds of big tech as well. So very complicated sets of questions about the implications of our work lives in this. I think one of the things I've been reflecting on recently quite a bit has been the ways that interdisciplinarity has been, or working beyond disciplines, has shown up in the kind of the European kind of funding context I work within, whether that's in our kind of science funders or in our kind of arts funders, has often been in calls. You know, increasingly we've got kind of grant calls that are shaping and deliberately asking for interdisciplinarity. But oftentimes what's fascinating is as many doors as that opens and enables, what's been really interesting sitting on some of these panels has been seeing what's been turning up as code for interdisciplinarity. And that may not be some of the sort of imaginations of this new intellectual climate that are coming out of that nature climate change exchange, where it's not, oh, you know, let's just, you know, if we put some social scientists and some arts and humanities scholars in a room and they all kind of, you know, add their own little bit to the problem, we're going to get a better answer. You know, what I think that is being called for is this kind of way of, you know, that slower sitting together to bring about those kinds of changed intellectual climates. And I think that's perhaps what feels like it isn't always showing up in what is being given as a response to these interdisciplinarity kind of calls for. I think one of the things we tried really hard to do with the Think Deep funding was to write it. Well, I wrote it as a very experimental space. In other words, it was one of those great grant funds that goes, we were going to fund you to do blue skies, what they call science. And what that means is that you can do anything that you wish, as long as you can actually argue that it's high risk, high gain. And so I could go into that grant application basically saying, this may not work. I want some money for a whole series of experiments that, yes, they're going to take me 5 years, and no, I can't tell you what they're going to look like at the start. And I certainly can't tell you how I want to organize even the artistic residencies as a residency program, because I don't know yet. It's going to depend what kind of shows up in the conversations. So where I found a home for doing that in Think Deep was in the kind of funding scheme I could apply for. I think what's been really interesting recently has been to see the evolution of, I guess, what I hope are paired kind of infrastructure kinds of grants, because it feels to me like some of the kinds of grants that let us have some of those experimental spaces. So like the workshops you were talking about having here, where stuff can be done differently, where you actually can have the time and space and money to rethink what the university colloquia looks like, to rethink how people might show up. So I was at an event in this room last night that was basically experimenting with conversation as a book genre and as a kind of event genre. And that to me felt like a really fascinating example of how we need to kind of find these ways to kind of rethink from the bottom up how we're going to do every single part of what we think of as our academic processes, whether that's our seminars, our teaching, our kind of grant applications. How can they look differently? But yeah, we need the funders that are able to let us argue for the openness and the experimentalness in that. Yeah, thank you.